Alexander the Great times Buddhist monks. The face of the Buddha, the image recognized across the world, from Sri Lanka to Japan to California, does not come from India, not in the form we know it. It was carved in workshops at the edge of empire, where the Hindu Kush descends toward the plains of the Punjab. Greek drapery falls in heavy folds across the shoulders. Apollo's features look out from the stone. The hair is pulled into a topknot, the place where the Ushnisha, the crown of awakening, rises from the skull of a fully awakened being. The form is Greek. What it carries is Indian. For the first 500 years of Buddhist art, no one carved the Buddha's face. The tradition refused. There were symbols: a wheel, a tree, an empty throne, 2 footprints in the dust, but no face. Then, in the 1st century of our era, in 2 places at once, the face appeared. One workshop was in North India, at Mathura, and the face it carved looked Indian. The other was in Gandhara, modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the face it carved looked Greek. How did Apollo end up carving the Buddha? The answer is a story that runs across 3 centuries, between 2 civilizations that should, by every measure of geography and language and worldview, have remained foreign to each other. One produced the greatest military conqueror in the ancient world. The other produced the tradition that teaches the only conquest that matters is self-conquest. They met, not once, but again and again. And what the encounter produced, across 300 years, was stranger and more lasting than either side could have anticipated. Tonight, 4 encounters, across 3 centuries. The results: a Greek philosopher who came home from India with a teaching that looks uncannily like the Buddha's. An Indian emperor who, after slaughtering 100,000 people, sent missionaries to 5 Greek kings by name. A Greek king who sat through what tradition records as 262 questions from a Buddhist monk and changed his coinage to carry the wheel of the Dhamma, and the face on the stone in Gandhara, where 2 worlds finally agreed on what a Buddha should look like, while a 3rd workshop, 1,000 kilometers south, disagreed. But tonight does not begin in stone. It begins in dust, in the brutal Punjab sun of the spring of 326 BCE, with the most powerful general in the known world sending an envoy to an Indian sage who is sitting naked on the ground. The general is Alexander, called the Great. The sage's name is Mandanus. We have what he said. 2,350 years later, his answer to Alexander's invitation has been preserved by the Greek geographer Strabo, and it remains, for anyone who reads it, one of the most arresting moments in the history of the ancient world. What the sage said was this: Alexander is not the son of Zeus. Because Alexander is not ruler over even a very small part of the earth, the conqueror of Persia, the conqueror of Egypt, the conqueror of the Achaemenid Empire and 1,000 miles east of it, told to his face through 3 interpreters that he ruled almost nothing. What did the sage know that the conqueror didn't? That is the question this video will answer. And the answer is not, in the end, one the Greeks brought home from India. It is a verse the Buddhist tradition had already been carrying for 200 years before Alexander was born. A verse from the Dhammapada, the book of the Buddha's sayings, number 103. Listen to it. Greater in battle than the man who would conquer 1,000 men is he who would conquer just one, himself. DPB 103. The canon's answer to everything Alexander represented. Written before Alexander represented anything. We begin in 326 BCE, at the edge of his empire, at the edge of the world he knew. Chapter 1: The Edge of the World. Alexander of Macedon was 30 years old. In 10 years, since he had crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE, he had broken 3 empires. Persia had fallen. Egypt had crowned him pharaoh. The lands east of the Tigris had passed into his hands. He had ridden 1,000 miles further than any Greek had ever ridden. He had founded cities and named them after himself in places his teacher Aristotle had only read about. He believed, and his army by now half believed, that he was the son of Zeus. In the spring of 326 BCE, he descended through the passes of the Hindu Kush and crossed the Indus into the Punjab. He came to a city called Taxila in Sanskrit, one of the oldest centers of learning in the Indian world. Brahmins taught the Vedas there. Shramana ascetics gathered there. The teachings of the Buddha, then about 200 years old, were known there. So were the teachings of the Jain master Mahavira, the Ajivika school, and a dozen other paths besides. Alexander, for reasons that have to do with his teacher Aristotle, and with the Greek love of philosophy, and with, perhaps, something else, wanted to meet the sages. The Greek accounts call them gymnosophists, which means simply the naked wise men. He sent his envoy to find them. The envoy was a man named Onesicritus. Onesicritus was a pupil of the Cynic philosopher Diogenes, the same Diogenes who, according to legend, had once told Alexander to step aside because he was blocking the sunlight. The Cynics taught that civilization was a disease, that wealth and luxury and clothing and titles were nothing but additions piled on top of the simple, natural life of an animal. They lived rough on purpose. Onesicritus must have thought himself well prepared for what he was about to find. He was not prepared. What he found, about 20 stadia, roughly 2.5 miles, outside the walls of Taxila, was 15 men, naked, motionless, sitting in the brutal Punjab sun, which by midday in late spring is hot enough to kill an unacclimatized European in a few hours. They had been sitting that way, apparently, for a long time. The first one to speak was a sage the Greeks called Calanus. Calanus laughed at Onesicritus. He laughed at the philosopher's mantle, at his broad-brimmed Macedonian hat, at his boots. And then Calanus told the envoy of the most powerful man in the world that if he wanted to hold a philosophical conversation, he would have to strip off his clothes and lie down naked on the hot stones. Otherwise, Calanus said, I will not converse with you, not even if you come from Zeus. This is in Strabo, the Greek geographer who, 300 years later, would compile the accounts of the men who had been on the campaign. The dialogue, we should say once, is not entirely secure. Onesicritus was a man with a reputation, even in antiquity, for embroidering his stories. Later generations of Cynic philosophers reworked these conversations into what scholars now call the Brahman tracts, philosophical dialogues that placed Cynic ideas into the mouths of Indian sages. The events of Onesicritus's mission are historically secure. The exact words of what was said have come down to us through a Cynic philosopher's pen and through 3 centuries of literary reworking. But the events are secure, and one event matters above all the others. The second sage who spoke that afternoon was named Mendanus. Some of the Greek sources, Arrian, Plutarch, call him Dandamus. It is the same man. Mendanus was older than Calanus. He may have been the senior figure among the gymnosophists. And Onesicritus, having delivered Alexander's invitation, come back to the camp, meet the king, accept his gifts, waited for Mendanus to reply. What Mendanus said is the spine of this story. He said, Alexander is not the son of Zeus, because Alexander is not ruler over even a very small part of the earth. He said, I have no need of Alexander's gifts. There is no satiety in such gifts. I want nothing he can give. He said, I do not fear his threats. India will feed me while I live, and when I die, death will release me to a better and purer life. Then he said something extraordinary about Onesicritus himself. He said he could forgive him if, attempting to convey Greek philosophy through 3 interpreters who knew no more about wisdom than the masses, the envoy had managed to convey nothing useful at all. Trying to philosophize through bad interpreters, Menander said, was like expecting water to flow pure through mud. This is in Strabo, Book 15, Chapter 1. The manuscripts of this particular passage are textually corrupt. The exact wording has not come down to us cleanly. But the sense of what Menander said is preserved across multiple Greek sources. He told the envoy of the world's greatest conqueror that they could not actually have a conversation. The mud was in the way, and then Menander did something else extraordinary. He did not insult Alexander. He praised him. He said that Alexander, although weighed down with the government of so vast an empire, had still found in himself the desire for wisdom. He is the only philosopher in arms, Menander said, that I have ever seen. But then he said it again. Alexander is not the son of Zeus, because he is not ruler over even a very small part of the earth. 2,350 years later, the words are still difficult. The man who had taken 3 empires told that he had taken almost nothing. The Greek sources say that Alexander, when this was reported to him, did not order Menander killed. He did not press the invitation. He commended the old man for his answer and let him be. There is something in Alexander, something his more sober biographers, like Arrian, took seriously, that recognized when it had been spoken to truly. We should pause here, before going any further, to be honest about what these sages were. The Greek accounts call them gymnosophists. The historian Megasthenes, who traveled to India a generation after Alexander, distinguished 2 great orders of Indian holy men, the Brahmanes, the Brahmins, and the Garmanes, or Sarmanes, which is the Greek attempt at the Sanskrit Shramana, the renunciate ascetic. The 15 men outside Taxila could have been Brahmins. They could have been Jain monks of the Digambara, the sky-clad order, who renounced clothing on principle. They could have been Ajivikas, followers of a now-vanished school. They could have been Buddhist Shramanas. Modern scholars, looking at what the Greek descriptions actually say, lean toward Brahmin or Jain. They do not lean toward Buddhist. So we should say this plainly, before going any further. Mandanus was not a Buddhist monk. Calanus was not a Buddhist monk. What Alexander met outside Taxila in 326 BCE was the broader Indian renunciate tradition out of which Buddhism had emerged. But the Buddhists themselves are not visible in reliable detail in these particular Greek accounts. The encounter is real. The participants we cannot exactly name, but it is in this broader Indian world, the world of renunciates and meditation, of teachings about suffering and the self and the path beyond them, that the Buddhist tradition lived and was already 2 centuries old. And it is from that tradition that the verse we began with comes. Dhammapada 103. The man who conquers 1,000 men in battle is less than the man who conquers himself. The Pali Canon was carrying this verse in oral form in the very years that Alexander was crossing the Indus. The teaching that became the canon's answer to Alexander existed before Alexander existed. One of the gymnosophists did follow Alexander. His name in the Indian sources was probably Sphinx. The Greeks called him Calanus because he greeted everyone with the Sanskrit word kalyana, which means good, and which Greek ears heard as kale. Calanus was older, perhaps 70. He chose to leave the company at Taxila and ride west with the Macedonian army. Why he did so, the Greek sources cannot fully explain. He stayed with Alexander for almost 3 years. He was, in some sense, the first Indian sage in residence with a Greek king, and he gave Alexander one teaching that the Greek sources preserved with care. Calanus laid a dry ox hide on the ground in front of the king. He stepped on one edge, and the opposite edge of the hide rose into the air. He stepped on another edge, and the first edge rose. Only when he stood in the very center of the hide did it lie flat all around him. Then he looked at Alexander and said, "This is your empire. Step on its edges, and the center will rise against you. Step on the other side, and the side you just left will rise. The only way to rule it is to stand in the center. Do not exhaust yourself at the edges." It is a teaching about empire, but it is also a teaching about the mind, about what happens when consciousness is dragged outward to the edges of itself, chasing one thing after another, while the center remains empty and unattended. Alexander did not seem to take the political lesson. He never returned to the center of his empire. He kept pushing east, then, when his army refused, south, then west, never sleeping in the same city more than a few months. In 323 BCE, in the city of Susa in Persia, Calanus fell ill. He was 73. He told Alexander that he wished to die, and that he wished to do so by fire, in the Indian way of a renunciate's end. Alexander tried to talk him out of it. Calanus would not be talked out of it. The king finally agreed. The pyre was built. The army was assembled. The chronicler Nearchus, Alexander's admiral who saw it, has left an account that has come down to us through later sources. As the fire caught, Nearchus wrote, by Alexander's order the bugles sounded, the army roared its battle cry, and the elephants trumpeted. Calanus did not flinch. He did not cry out. He did not move. The Greeks, who had seen many deaths, who had killed thousands of men in war, watched this old Indian die without expression, and were marked by it for the rest of their lives. Several of them, in later years, wrote about it. Tradition records that as he was preparing for the fire, Calanus said farewell to Alexander with a strange line. "We shall meet in Babylon." Alexander did not understand what he meant. About a year later, in the early summer of 323 BCE, Alexander died of fever in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. The Greeks remembered. We should label this carefully. The "we shall meet in Babylon" prophecy is in the Greek sources, but it is in the sources that love such things. The kind of poignant ending that historians of antiquity tended to compose after the fact. Whether Calanus actually said it, or whether someone in the camp wrote it in afterward, we do not know. The tradition is real. The line itself is tradition, not document. What is document is this: an Indian sage who refused to come to Alexander, another Indian sage who chose to ride with him for 3 years and then to die by fire as Alexander watched, and a king who, when he was told he ruled almost nothing, commended the old man who had told him and let him be. What is also document is the verse from the canon, the book of the Buddha's sayings, Number 103. DHP 103. Greater in battle than the man who would conquer 1,000 men is he who would conquer just one, himself. We come now to the second strand of the story, to a Greek philosopher who was actually with Alexander's army in India, who actually spoke with Indian sages, perhaps with these very gymnosophists, and who, when he came home, brought a teaching with him. His name was Pyrrho, and what he taught the Greeks when he returned looks, to readers 2,300 years later, almost exactly like the Buddha. Chapter 2. The Philosopher Who Walked Home. Pyrrho of Elis was born around 360 BCE. As a young man, he attached himself to a philosopher named Anaxarchus, one of the thinkers who traveled with Alexander's army on the Eastern campaign, and Pyrrho went with them. He was, in his late 30s, in the very dust of the Punjab, in 326 BCE. Whether he sat down outside Taxila with the 15 naked sages, we cannot prove. The Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius, writing 5 centuries later, says only that Pyrrho went as far as the gymnosophists in India and the Magi in Persia. But Pyrrho was there. He saw the men whose tradition the Greeks did not have words for. He stayed long enough to be marked. Then, after about 18 months in India, Pyrrho came home. He went back to Elis, a small city in the western Peloponnese. He lived there for the rest of his life, until his death around 270 BCE. He wrote nothing. He started a school, in a manner of speaking. Most of what we know about his teaching comes from a follower named Timon of Phlius, and from a much later summary preserved in the Christian apologist Eusebius, who in turn was quoting a philosopher named Aristocles. The chain is long, the transmission is thin, but what the chain preserves is striking. Pyrrho, according to Aristocles via Eusebius, taught that anyone who wanted to live well, what the Greeks called eudaimonia, flourishing, had to answer 3 questions in the right order. First, what is the nature of things? His answer was 3 words in Greek that have rung in philosophy departments ever since. Adiaphora, things are undifferentiated. Astathmata, they are unstable, unmeasurable. Anepikrita, they are undecidable. You cannot really say what anything is in itself. Second, given that, what attitude should we take toward things? His answer was epoche, suspension of judgment. You do not assert that things are this way or that. You hold every claim alongside its opposite, what he called isostheneia, the equal force of opposing arguments, and you do not come down on either side. Third, what follows from holding things this way? His answer was, first, aphasia, non-assertion, silence, and then, finally, ataraxia, tranquility, peace, the mind that is no longer being torn between competing certainties. That is Pyrrho, a Greek who had walked east with Alexander's army, sat in some way with the Indian sages, walked home, and built a philosophy whose center was the suspension of metaphysical judgment and the peace that follows. Read it once more, slowly. Things are undifferentiated, unstable, undecidable. The proper attitude is to suspend judgment. The result is peace. If you have spent any time in the early Buddhist suttas, you have heard this before. In the Majjhima Nikaya, there is a discourse called the Aggivaccagota Sutta, MN 72. A wandering ascetic named Vacchagotta comes to the Buddha and presses him on the 10 great speculative questions of the day. Is the cosmos eternal? Is it not eternal? Is it both? Is it neither? Is the soul the same as the body or different? Does the awakened one exist after death? or not, or both, or neither? The Buddha refuses to answer. Vacchagotta is bewildered. The Buddha then explains why, in a line the Theravada tradition has remembered for 2.5 millennia. A position, vacca, is something that a Tathagata has done away with. He has put away taking positions. Then he gives a simile. He asks Vacchagotta, if a fire is burning, you can say which direction it is leaning. But if it has gone out, where has the fire gone? North? South? East? West? Vacchagotta says, the question does not fit. A fire that has gone out cannot be located in those terms. The Buddha says, just so, the awakened one cannot be located in your speculative categories. He is, the Sutta says, deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom, like the ocean. There is another discourse, the Ananda Sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, SN 4410. The same Vacchagotta comes back on a different day with a sharper question. Is there a self? The Buddha is silent. Is there no self? The Buddha is silent. Vacchagotta gets up and leaves. Ananda, troubled, asks why the Buddha did not answer either way. The reply is precise. To affirm a self would have placed him with the eternalists. To deny a self would have placed him with the annihilationists. And either answer would only have deepened Vacchagotta's confusion, not freed him from it. And there is a third sutta, perhaps the most famous of them all, the Kula Malunkhya in the Majjhima Nikaya, MN 63. The poisoned arrow. A man has been struck by an arrow. His friends bring a surgeon, but the man refuses treatment until he knows who shot the arrow, what his caste was, what his name was, what village he came from, what the bow was made of, what the feathers on the shaft were. He would die, the Buddha says, with all of those questions still unanswered. The same trap, named 3 different ways, metaphysical questions that breed disturbance instead of peace. The Buddha refuses to play the game. He treats the speculative tetralemma. Is it X? Is it not X? Is it both? Is it neither? As an arrow still in the body. Now read Piro's 3 answers again. Adiaphora, astathmata, and epikrita. Things are undifferentiated, unstable, undecidable. The proper attitude is to suspend judgment. The result is peace. This is the same structure. It is so close that in 2015, the historian Christopher Beckwith published a book called Greek Buddha, making the boldest possible argument. Beckwith claimed that Piro's 3 Greek terms map directly onto the Buddhist 3 marks of existence, the trilaksana. Anatman, non-self, becomes adiaphora, undifferentiated. Anitya, impermanence, becomes astathmata, unstable. Dukkha, suffering or unsatisfactoriness, becomes anepikrita, undecidable. 3 for 3. Beckwith's conclusion. This is not parallel evolution. This is transmission. Piro, he says, brought Buddhism home from Gandhara and called it by Greek names. Beckwith's book has been hugely controversial. The leading Ashoka scholar, Patrick Olivelle, has called it an outlier, saying no mainstream Ashokan scholar would subscribe to that view. Johannes Bronkhorst, perhaps the most prominent living scholar of Indian philosophy, has been highly critical. Osmond Boparachchi, the historian of the Indo-Greek world, has been critical. Reviews in the major journals, the Bryn Mawr Classical Review, the Classical Review, have said roughly the same thing. Interesting, stimulating, but the boldest claims are unlikely to survive scrutiny. The most careful critic, the Piro scholar Richard Bett at Johns Hopkins, has said something more interesting still. Bett acknowledges that Beckwith has made the stronger case than anyone else to date. Bett admits the parallels are too similar to dismiss as coincidence. But Bett himself is skeptical that substantive philosophical transmission could have happened. And his main reason is the reason we have already met: the three interpreters, who knew no more than the masses. If Mandanus was right, if you cannot philosophize through 3 layers of bad translation, if expecting wisdom to pass through that filter is like expecting water to flow pure through mud, then Pyrrho, who would have been operating through the same kind of filter, could not have learned the actual content of the Buddhist teaching. He could have seen the shape of it, the silence, the refusal to be drawn, the peace of an old man sitting in the sun. But he could not, Bett argues, have learned the Dharma in any precise sense. Whatever Pyrrho brought home was either a deep convergence, 2 traditions arriving independently at the same insight about metaphysics and peace, or it was something harder to describe, a shape of mind absorbed by encounter rather than by argument. The debate is alive. The transmission is contested. The parallels are not. What is settled, what nobody disputes, is that 2 traditions arrived, in roughly the same period, at the same insight about speculative questions. Asking what the universe ultimately is, or what the self ultimately is, for both of them, an arrow in the body. The cure is not to answer. The cure is to put the arrow down. There is a difference. We should name it before moving on. When the Buddha is silent in the Ananda Sutta, his silence is held up by something underneath it. He is not refusing to speak because he has no view. He is refusing to speak because every view he could state, including there is a self or there is no self, would mislead. Underneath the silence is a positive teaching. Anatta, dependent origination, a path that leads to the end of suffering. The fire simile in the Agi Vachagata points at this. The awakened one, like a fire that has gone out, is not nothing. He is deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom, like the ocean. Something has been put down, but what remains is not nihilism. It is what the suttas call unbinding. Pyrrho's epoche is leaner. Pyrrho does not have, underneath his suspension of judgment, a doctrine of non-self or interdependence or liberation. He has the suspension itself and the peace that follows from it. That is enough for Pyrrho to live well, but it is not the same architecture as the Buddhas, same structure, different foundation. What we can say, what the careful reading of both traditions supports, is this. Somewhere between the brutal sun of Taxila in 326 BCE and the small streets of Elis a generation later, an insight crossed. Whether by transmission or by convergence, an insight about the relationship between metaphysical certainty and human peace appeared in Greek philosophy in a form that had been alive in India for 2 centuries already. Pyrrhonism became a current in Western thought. It influenced the late Greek skeptics. It influenced Montaigne. It influenced Hume. The current ran from then on. But the river it had touched, perhaps glimpsed, perhaps drawn from, was older. We come now to a king, not Alexander, not anymore. In the generation after Alexander's death, his empire shattered. The generals divided it among themselves. They fought each other for a century. And in India, in the chaos that followed Alexander's withdrawal, a young man rose who would unify almost the entire subcontinent for the first time in its history. His name was Ashoka. He became, by his own account, the greatest mass killer India had ever known. And then, after killing 100,000 people in a single war, he stopped. Chapter 3: The Mirror Kings. Ashoka was born around 304 BCE, 20 years after Alexander died in Babylon. He was the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the dynasty that had risen in the chaos Alexander's withdrawal left behind. By the time Ashoka came to the throne, around 268 BCE, the Mauryan Empire stretched across almost the entire Indian subcontinent, from what is now Afghanistan in the northwest to what is now Karnataka in the south. It was the largest political entity India had ever known. It was, in every way that mattered, the Indian answer to what Alexander had tried to build. For the first 8 years of his reign, Ashoka completed the empire by conquest. The last major holdout was a kingdom called Kalinga on the eastern coast, roughly the modern state of Odisha. In 261 BCE, Ashoka invaded. What happened next, we know in Ashoka's own words. He had it carved into rock. Across his empire, on cliff faces and on polished sandstone pillars, Ashoka left a series of edicts, proclamations to his people. They were carved in Prakrit, the everyday language, in scripts that ordinary people could read. In one of them, the 13th Rock Edict, Ashoka writes about what he did in Kalinga. He gives numbers. 150,000 people, he says, were deported. 100,000 were slain. And this is the line that has stopped readers for 2,000 years. Many times that number died. These are his own figures, carved into rock in the first person by the king who did it. There is no other ancient monarch on record who confessed in writing to a mass killing on this scale. Not Alexander, not the Achaemenids, not the Romans. Ashoka named the numbers himself. And then he says, this filled him with remorse. The rest of Rock Edict 13 is a turn. Ashoka tells his people, and tells the future, that from that day forward, he will pursue a different kind of conquest. The Sanskrit Prakrit word he uses is Dhammavijaya, conquest by Dhamma. He renounces military conquest as the measure of a king. He proclaims that the only true conquest, the only one worth doing, is conquest by righteousness. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in the political history of the world. A king at the height of his power, looking at the bodies of 100,000 people he had ordered killed, deciding that the entire idea of what a king does has been wrong, and then carving the decision into rock so that no future king of his line and no subject of his realm could pretend he had not said it. What followed over the next 30 years of Ashoka's reign was a project without precedent. He sent missionaries, not soldiers, missionaries. He built hospitals, including hospitals for animals. He planted shade trees along the roads. He dug wells. He ordered that game hunting cease on royal lands, and that the great festival hunts of the kings be replaced by what he called Dhamma Yatras, journeys to teach. And in the same 13th Rock Edict, where he confessed Kalinga, he named the kings to whom he sent his messengers. There are 5 of them. They are all Greek. The Prakrit gives them in a kind of phonetic transcription that scholars in the 19th century, led by an English Orientalist named James Prinsep, were able to decode. Antiocha, Antiochus II, the Seleucid king who ruled from Antioch, the lands that had once been Persia. Turamiya, Ptolemy II of Egypt, the one who built the Library of Alexandria. Amtikini, Antigonus II of Macedon, ruling from the city where Alexander had been born. Macha, Magus, king of Cyrene, in what is now Libya, and Alikasudara, most probably Alexander II of Epirus, ruling in what is now northwestern Greece. The 5 Greek kings to whom an Indian Buddhist emperor sent missionaries to teach the Dhamma. Carved into rock around 256 BCE. They are named. The Sri Lankan chronicles, the Dupavamsa and the Mahavamsa, written some centuries later, give the names of some of the monks he sent. One of them was an elder called Dhammarakita, sent to a western region. The name itself is Indian, but the chronicles say he was a Yona, a Greek. And another monk called Mahadamarakita is said to have come from Alessandra, the city of the Yonas, Alexandria of the Caucasus, one of the cities Alexander himself had founded, now turned into a center of Buddhist monastic life. We should be careful with the numbers in the chronicles. The Mahavamsa says Mahadamarakita came with 30,000 monks. The numbers in the chronicles are formulaic, large round numbers used to signify a great many. What is widely accepted is the fact behind the numbers. There were Greek Buddhist monks. They were operating across the Hellenistic world. They were teaching, in some cases, in Greek. Behind the missions and the edicts and the trees planted along the roads is a vision of kingship that the Pali Canon had been articulating before Ashoka was born. It is most directly stated in a discourse in the Digha Nikaya called the Kakavati-Shanada, DN 26, the roar of the wheel-turning monarch. In this discourse, the Buddha describes the ideal king, what the suttas call the Kakavati, the universal monarch. The Kakavati is not a conqueror in the ordinary sense. The text is precise. The righteous wheel-turning monarch, it says, dwells having conquered this sea-girt land without stick or sword, by the Dhamma, without stick or sword, by the Dhamma. This is the mirror the Buddhist tradition holds up to Alexander. The canon's vision of what a great king could be is the exact inversion of what Alexander tried to be. Alexander, who took 3 empires with the sword, and whose own empire shattered within years of his death. The Kakavati, who rules without weapons, by the force of righteousness alone. Ashoka was not literally the Kakavati of the suttas. The Kakavati is a mythic figure, a wheel-turning emperor whose authority arises from his merit. Ashoka was a flesh-and-blood emperor who had reached the throne by the same methods every dynastic founder had, and who, after Kalinga, tried to behave like the Kakavati. He is the closest the historical record gives us to the canonical vision. The world's first attempt by a great power to govern by the principle that the only real conquest is the conquest of oneself. And then, in the next breath, the historical record gives us something else. After Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire weakened. By the early 2nd century BCE, about 150 years after Alexander's death, the northwest of India had once again become a contact zone. Greek kings, the descendants of Alexander's generals and of the soldiers he had left behind in his Bactrian foundations, ruled a patchwork of kingdoms across the Hindu Kush and down into the Punjab. They are called, in modern scholarship, the Indo-Greeks. One of them was the most powerful Indo-Greek king who ever lived. His name in Greek was Menandros. The Pali sources call him Milinda. We have placed his reign, with reasonable confidence, between roughly 165 and 130 BCE. He ruled a great territory. His capital was at a city called Sagala, modern Sialkot, in what is now Pakistan. Now, hear the chronology, because it matters. Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE. Menander was born around 200 years later. He is not Alexander. He is not Alexander's general. He is not Alexander's son. He is the great-great-great-grandson, in a manner of speaking, 5 or 6 generations removed, of the Greeks who had stayed behind in the cities Alexander founded. By the time Menander rules, those Greeks have been in India for almost 2 centuries. They speak Greek, and they speak the local Indian languages. Their coins carry Greek legends on one side and Indian languages on the other. They worship Greek gods in some places, Indian gods in others. They are, by Menander's lifetime, a hybrid people. We have a text that tells us, in dialogue form, of a series of conversations between this Greek king and a Buddhist monk. The text is called the Milindapanya, the Questions of Melinda. It is one of the most remarkable documents the Indian-Greek encounter produced. A note on what the Milindapanya is before we read from it. The Milindapanya is not in the 4 primary Nikayas of the Pali Canon, not in the long discourses, the middle length, the connected, or the numbered. It is included in the Khuddaka Nikaya of the Burmese Pali Canon. The Thai and Sri Lankan traditions do not include it in their canons. It is what scholars call para-canonical, held in extraordinary esteem, quoted constantly by the great 5th century commentator Buddhaghosa, treated by the tradition as authoritative, but not itself a discourse of the Buddha. The form is dialogue, modeled in its structure on something familiar to Greek readers, and in its content on something deeply Indian. The Buddhist monk it features, Nagasena, is not attested in any other source. The great German scholar Oskar von Hinüber has noted that Nagasena exists, historically speaking, only in this text. King Menander, by contrast, is amply attested in Greek and Indian sources alike. He was real, whether his interlocutor was a single historical monk or a literary composite, we cannot say. Across the full text, 262 questions pass between them. The king is sharp. The text presents him as relentless, as a hard questioner, as someone who is not satisfied with simple answers. The monk is patient. The exchange that has lasted, the exchange that the Buddhist tradition has remembered for 2 millennia, is the very first one. The king asks the monk his name. The monk replies that he is called Nagasena, but he adds, Nagasena is only a designation, a conventional name. No permanent self can be found inside the name. The king pushes back. If that is so, he says, then who is it that gives alms? Who is it that earns merit? Who is it that commits crimes and reaps the result? If there is no Nagasena underneath the name, then your whole religion makes no sense. The monk says, Great king, how did you arrive here today? The king says, by chariot. The monk says, show me the chariot. Are the wheels the chariot? The king says, no. The monk says, is the axle the chariot? No. The pole, the yoke, the reins, the goad? No, 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 no. The monk says, is the chariot the sum of all those parts together? No. The monk says, is the chariot something separate from those parts? No. The monk says, then, great king, there is no chariot. And the king has to stop because, of course, there is a chariot. He arrived in it. He is standing here looking at it, yet he cannot point to it. Wheels are not the chariot. The axle is not the chariot. The sum of the parts is not the chariot. There is no chariot apart from the parts. And yet here is the chariot. The monk says, chariot is a conventional designation, a useful name for an assembly of parts that work together in a certain way. Just so, Nagasena is a conventional designation for the assembly of the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. that work together in a certain way. There is a Nagasena in the sense that there is a functioning assembly. There is no Nagasena in the sense of a fixed core that owns the parts. This is the doctrine of anatta, the non-self, taught to a Greek king by a Buddhist monk in the form of a chariot, the same machine, by the way, that Alexander's army had used to conquer the world. Nagasena himself, in the Milindapanya, credits the chariot simile to an earlier source. Some generations before, a nun named Vajira had used the same image to answer the demon Mara, who had come to disturb her with the question of who she was. SN 510. In the Vajira Sutta, Vajira tells Mara, just as where there is the assembly of parts, the word chariot is used, so where there is the assembly of the aggregates, the convention being is used. The chariot is canonical. The chariot was in the Samyutta Nikaya before Menander's grandfather was born. The monk is quoting the nun. In another part of the Pali Canon, the Buddha himself uses the Greeks, uses Menander's ancestors, to make a related point. In a discourse called the Asalayana Sutta, MN 93, the Buddha is debating a Brahmin who argues for the absolute reality of the caste system. The Buddha asks him, have you not heard that in Yona? The Pali word, as Bhikkhu Bodhi has noted, is simply the Pali transliteration of Ionia, meaning the Greek world, and in Cambodia and other outland countries. There are only two castes, masters and slaves, and that a master can become a slave and a slave a master. The Buddha is using the Greeks as evidence against the metaphysical reality of the caste system. The categories the Brahmin treats as written into the universe, the Buddha treats as conventions that vary by geography, like the chariot, like the name Nagasena, like everything else. We have one more piece of physical evidence for what was happening between Menander and the Dhamma, his coins. Most of Menander's coins look like the coins of any Hellenistic king. They carry his portrait on one side. They carry an image of a Greek god, usually Athena, on the other side. They are stamped in Greek with his royal titles. They are, in style and content, the coins of a Greek monarch in the Hellenistic tradition. But there is a limited bronze issue, not the main coin type, a smaller, distinct issue. On one side of these coins, the Greek legend reads Basileos Soteros Menandrou, of King Savior Menander. On the other side, in Kharosth script, the Indian language reads Maharajasa Dharmikasa, of the great king, the follower of the Dharma. And the image on the Indian side is the eight-spoked wheel, the Dhammacakka, the wheel of the Dhamma, the same wheel that turns at the center of the Indian flag today, 2,000 years later, taken from the lion capital pillar of Ashoka. Limited issue, not most of the coins, but these few coins exist. A Greek king on a piece of bronze called himself Savior in Greek and follower of the Dharma in an Indian language, and stamped the symbol of the Buddha's first sermon onto the metal. When Menander died, around 130 BCE, the Greek biographer Plutarch, who is normally a clear-eyed source, recorded something that is worth pausing for. Plutarch says that Menander died on campaign, and that the cities of his realm contested for his remains. The remains were divided among the cities, and each one, Plutarch says, enshrined its share. The Greek word Plutarch uses can mean simply monuments, but the practice he is describing remains divided among cities, enshrined as objects of veneration, is exactly what the Buddhist tradition was doing with the relics of the Buddha. The first stupas of Buddhism were built around the divided relics of Gautama, distributed after his cremation to the cities that claimed him. Plutarch, who is not a Buddhist source, who is writing in Greek for a Greek audience, is describing what looks unmistakably like Buddhist burial honors for an Indo-Greek king. 2 centuries after Alexander, in the same northwestern Indian world that Alexander had passed through, a Greek king named Menander asked a Buddhist monk 262 questions, struck a coin with the wheel of the Dhamma, and was buried in stupas. We have come a long way from the brutal son of Taxila. We have not yet come to the strangest result of all. The strangest result is in stone. It is a face. It is a face that, when you stand in front of it for the first time, you cannot quite believe. We end where we began. We end in Gandhara. Chapter 4. The Face in the Stone. The workshops of Gandhara stood in what is now eastern Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan, the cities of Peshawar, Taxila again, the valley of the Swat River. They worked under the Kushans, a Central Asian dynasty that ruled the region from roughly the late 1st century into the 4th century of our era. The Kushans were not Greek. They had absorbed Greek visual culture by inheritance, the visual vocabulary that the Indo-Greeks had been using for centuries, by then transmitted through generations of craftsmen who had never seen the Aegean Sea. They were Buddhists, and in their workshops, for the first time in the history of the tradition, the face of the Buddha was carved. We need to say one thing first about why this was extraordinary. For the first 500 years of Buddhist art, the Buddha had no face. The tradition refused. The earliest Buddhist art, on the stupas of Sanchi and Bharhut in central India from the 2nd century BCE forward, is full of scenes from the Buddha's life, but the Buddha himself is never shown. Where he should be, there is a symbol instead. A wheel where he gave his first sermon. A Bodhi tree where he was awakened. An empty throne under a parasol where he sat. 2 footprints in the dust where he had stood. The tradition treated the human form as inadequate to the awakened being. The aniconic period, scholars call it. 5 centuries of refusing the face. Then, around the turn of the 1st century of our era, the refusal ended. In 2 places at once. The workshops of Gandhara began to carve a Buddha. So, simultaneously, did the workshops of Mathura, 1,000 kilometers to the southeast, on the Yamuna River in north-central India. 2 traditions, 2 faces. One question: how do you make the invisible visible? The face the Gandharan workshops carved looks Greek. The drapery, the heavy folds of a toga-like himation falling across the shoulder, is Greek. The contrapposto stance, the weight on one leg, the slight bend of the hip, Greek. The wavy hair gathered into a topknot at the crown is Greek hair on a Buddha's body. The anatomy is the idealized anatomy of Hellenistic sculpture, the same body type you would find on Apollo, on Hermes, on any number of late Greek sculptures of young divine men. The face, the calm, slightly downcast, perfectly proportioned face, is the face of a god of the Hellenistic Mediterranean. The Encyclopedia Britannica has called it Apollo-like, and the bodyguard of the Buddha in Gandharan sculpture, a figure called Vajrapani, the thunderbolt bearer, is carved in Gandhara with the body and the muscles and even the lion skin cape of Heracles. The Greek demigod has become the Buddha's protector. The conqueror of monsters is now the doorkeeper of the awakened one. The drapery comes from Athens. The body comes from Apollo. The bodyguard comes from Heracles. What remains is Indian. The iconography, the top-knot Ushnisha as the sign of awakening, the Dhammakaka mudra of the hands setting the wheel in motion, the lotus throne, the very meaning of what the figure is entirely Indian. The form is Greek. The meaning is the Buddha's. But meanwhile, in Mathura, 1,000 kilometers to the south, the workshops of Mathura were also carving the Buddha's face for the first time. They were not doing it through Greek conventions. The Mathura Buddhas have Indian physiognomy, fuller faces, broader features, a different proportion. They wear the sanghati, the robe of an Indian monk, not the hymation of a Greek athlete. The stance is different. The smile is different. They were carved by artists who had no Greek inheritance to draw on, working out the same problem the Gandharan workshops were working out: how to depict the indepictable, and arriving at a different answer. Two traditions, two faces, one question. This is the part of the story that is sometimes forgotten when we speak of the Greek Buddha. There is no Greek Buddha. There is a Greek-influenced style of carving the Buddha that emerged in one region of the Buddhist world. There is also an Indian feature style, simultaneous, independent, working from purely Indian visual conventions. The full image of the Buddha that the tradition would eventually settle into is the synthesis of both, and of a third tradition we have not yet named, the halo. In almost every depiction of the Buddha that came after the 1st century CE, his head is surrounded by a circle of light. The Sanskrit word is Prabhamandala, the sphere of radiance. The Indian Buddhist tradition before this date did not show the Buddha with a halo, because it did not show the Buddha at all. The halo arrives with the face. The halo is not primarily Greek. It is not primarily Indian. It is something that emerges from the interaction of three traditions. In Greek visual culture, the radiant crown of the sun god Helios was a familiar image, used for solar and divine figures. In Persian and Iranian visual culture, going back to the Achaemenids, there is a concept called kvarina, sometimes rendered far in later Persian. The divine radiance that surrounds and legitimates a true king. Persian royal coinage, going back centuries before the Kushans, depicts kings with a halo of kvarena around their heads. The Kushans themselves were Iranian speakers who had taken over the Greek-Indian world of Gandhara. On Kushan coinage, the king is shown with a halo. On Kushan Buddha sculpture, the Buddha is shown with a halo. A shared Eurasian visual language of divinity, absorbed at the crossroads, applied to the awakened one, not from one tradition, from the convergence of three. And here's what we need to say before we close. Most of these images were not carved in Alexander's lifetime. They were not carved in Menander's lifetime either. The great flourishing of Gandharan Buddha sculpture is under the Kushans, 2 to 4 centuries after Alexander. What the Greeks left behind in Gandhara was not a direct stylistic transmission from craftsmen Alexander had brought. It was an inherited visual vocabulary, absorbed across generations, transformed by artists who had never set foot in Greece. The aesthetic Alexander's expedition had introduced lived on. It outlasted, by centuries, the political entities the Greeks had founded. It outlasted the kingdoms of the Indo-Greeks. It outlasted, in the end, the Kushans themselves. It is still living. Every time you look at a Buddha in a temple in Japan, or in a museum in California, or on a wall in Thailand, you are looking, in part, at what those workshops solved. How do you make the invisible visible? They solved it twice. Once in Mathura with Indian features. Once in Gandhara with Greek drapery on an Indian body and a Persian halo around the head. The face the world remembers is the synthesis. What the encounter produced in the end is a face. The face of the man who said, 2,500 years ago, that the only conquest that matters is the conquest of yourself. Epilogue: The Only Conquest. Alexander the Great died at the age of 32 in the summer of 323 BCE in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Tradition records that his last words, when asked who should inherit his empire, were, "To the strongest." The empire he had built, the largest the world had ever seen, did not survive him. His generals divided it. They fought each other for the next 40 years. The Macedonian dynasty he founded in Egypt would last 300 years and end with Cleopatra. The Macedonian dynasty he founded in Persia would last almost as long and end in conquest by other men. The cities he had named for himself, scattered from the Nile to the Hindu Kush, would mostly forget his name within a century. The man who had conquered the known world was old in the sense that mattered before he was old. The verse he had been told in 326 BCE by an old man sitting naked in the Punjab sun was not new to the world even then. Dhammapada 103 had been carried by the Buddhist tradition in oral form for 2 centuries before Alexander crossed the Indus. It is being read aloud somewhere in the world every day. Greater in battle than the man who would conquer 1,000 men is he who would conquer just one, himself. DHP 103. 3 centuries of encounter. A Greek philosopher who walked east with Alexander and walked home with, at the very least, the shape of a teaching about peace. An Indian emperor who, after killing 100,000 people in one campaign, carved his remorse into rock and sent missionaries to 5 Greek kings he named by name. A Greek king who, 2 centuries after Alexander, sat through 262 questions from a Buddhist monk and changed the symbol on his coinage, and a face, 2 faces, really. One in the workshops of Mathura with Indian features, and one in the workshops of Gandhara with Greek drapery and Persian light, that the world remembers and the tradition would carry forward. The naked Indian sage told the world's greatest conqueror to his face that he ruled almost nothing. He was not being unkind. He was pointing at something that the Buddhist tradition had been pointing at for 2 centuries already. There is one country that cannot be invaded, cannot be partitioned, cannot be lost. There is one battlefield on which victories cannot be reversed by the next generation's politics or the next century's tides. There is one conquest that is permanent. There is one conquest that no death of a king, no shattering of an empire, no defection of a general, no failure of a successor can take back. It is the conquest of yourself. That is what the encounter was actually about. That is what the Buddhist lens has been illuminating from the first frame of this video. 2 civilizations, 3 centuries, 4 encounters. A philosopher's peace, an emperor's remorse, a king's questions, a face in the stone, and one verse that ran through all of it, older than Alexander, more persistent than empire. The teaching that the only conquest that matters is the conquest of one, yourself.